Labor Day weekend, 1973. A calm Michigan beach. Families laugh, children play. The golden sun melts into the horizon. But beneath this perfect picture, something unthinkable was waiting to be found. What looked like a boy resting on the sand was no nap. It was no dream. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Because this was murder. Welcome to Mystery in the Dark, the place where the shadows of history collide with unsolved crimes, and where forgotten voices whisper once again. If you crave the secrets America still hides, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because tonight, we reopen a case buried in silence for over 50 years. A chilling cold case from Frankfort, Michigan. Frankfort, Michigan, a postcard-perfect lakeside town. In 1973, it was the kind of place families trusted. Safe beaches, a proud lighthouse, and neighbors who knew each other by name. Crime was rare. Violence? Almost unthinkable. Among those who called Frankfort home was 15-year-old Terry Wayne Sutter. Like most kids his age, he loved hanging out with friends, cracking jokes, and spending weekends the way teenagers do. Bowling, cruising, or just breathing in the lake air. He wasn't a troublemaker. In fact, everyone who knew him remembered him as fun-loving, lighthearted, and kind. But on September 1st, 1973, Labor Day weekend, that perfect picture shattered forever. It was a Saturday evening. Some say Terry was heading out to go bowling. Others recall he might have planned to meet friends, maybe even stop by a small party in town. The truth is lost in the haze of small-town memory. But one fact remains. Terry never came home that night. As the hours passed, his mother's worry grew heavier. This wasn't like her son. Terry wasn't the kind of boy to disappear without a word. And by the time night surrendered to morning, fear had taken hold. The next day, September 2nd, 1973, a tourist strolling the sandy shore of Lake Michigan noticed something unusual near the dunes. At first glance, it seemed harmless, just a teenager resting after a swim. But as the tourist drew closer, a chill set in. The boy wasn't moving. He wasn't sunbathing. It was Terry Sutter, lifeless, still, gone. At first, whispers spread. It must have been a tragic accident. Maybe Terry had gone for a swim, caught by a current, pulled under by the lake. After all, drownings weren't unheard of here. But soon, the truth emerged, and it was far darker than anyone could have imagined. When Terry's body was returned to his family, grief filled the home. But his mother and grandmother couldn't ignore what they saw. Something felt wrong. At the funeral home, staff quietly suggested a closed casket. Terry's body bore too many bruises, too many cuts, too many marks that didn't belong to drowning. But his grandmother refused. She wanted the truth exposed. She wanted the world to see this was no accident. And when mourners gazed into that casket, they saw it for themselves. Bruises across his face and body, signs of violence no lake could explain. The whispers began to spread. How could a boy, so full of life, be returned in this state? What really happened to Terry Sutter? The coroner's findings sent shockwaves through investigators. When Terry's lungs were examined, they weren't filled with water. They were filled with sand. Yes, grain after grain packed deep inside his lungs, his nose, even behind his eyes. This wasn't drowning. This was suffocation. Terry had been forced face first into the sand until he could no longer breathe. One investigator would later describe it chillingly. His lungs felt crunchy. This was no accident. This was murder, deliberate, brutal, and personal. The image of a simple drowning had shattered. This was darker, calculated, intentional violence. But if Terry was murdered, who did it? And why? Was it a random act of cruelty? A fight gone too far? Or was Terry silenced because he knew something? Something so dangerous it cost him his life. And if murder wasn't enough, what happened after Terry's death would haunt this town for decades to come. The town of Frankfort had been whispering ever since Terry's body was found, but the autopsy report turned whispers into a scream. Terry hadn't drowned in Lake Michigan. He had been murdered on the very beach where he was found. The sand in his lungs told the story no one wanted to believe. Someone had shoved him face first into the ground. He struggled, he choked, he suffocated. It was slow, it was painful, it was deliberate. The bruises across his face and body weren't from waves or currents. They were from fists, from violence, from a fight. For Terry's family, grief was no longer enough. Now there was rage. They demanded answers, but the quiet town of Frankfort wasn't ready to give them. At the funeral home, directors urged the family to keep the casket closed. Terry's face was battered, his skin bruised and swollen. They said it would be too painful for mourners to see. But Terry's grandmother refused. She said only one thing: people need to know what they did to him. And so, the casket stayed open. When the community walked past, they didn't just see a boy laid to rest. They saw the proof of violence, the blackened bruises, the swelling, the unmistakable evidence of an attack. The whispers grew louder. Some wept. Some turned away in silence. And some never came to the funeral at all, as if certain people in Frankfort already knew more than they were willing to admit. The case had now shifted from a possible accident to homicide, but police in 1973 did not move with urgency. Terry's body had already been treated like a drowning victim, not a crime scene. Crucial evidence was lost. Witnesses weren't pressed hard enough, and in Frankfort, the whispers grew louder. Some said certain names, local kids, maybe even people with connections, were never investigated the way they should have been. The official story was simple. Yes, it's a homicide, but we have no leads. The unofficial story? People believed there were suspects everyone knew, but no one dared to name. If the murder wasn't horrifying enough, what came after sent chills through the entire community. Terry's grave was not left in peace. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. His headstone was smashed with blunt force. The flower pots his mother left in grief shattered. Shrubs planted in his memory ripped out of the ground. This was not random vandalism. This was deliberate, personal, cruel. Who would do this to the resting place of a murdered child, and why? Some believed it was the killer himself, returning to erase Terry's memory to keep the family in pain. Others whispered it was a warning. Stay silent. Stop asking questions. Eventually, after years of torment, Terry's headstone was removed entirely. And today, he lies in an unmarked grave. Imagine that. A boy brutally murdered and even in death denied peace. Frankfort wasn't some sprawling city where murders could vanish into statistics. This was a small town where everyone knew everyone. And yet, when Terry's name came up, the town grew quiet, unnaturally quiet. Reporters who returned years later said they could feel the resistance, as if Terry's death wasn't just an unsolved crime, but a secret buried deep in the heart of Frankfort. Was it fear? Was it guilt? Or was it loyalty to protect someone? No one could say for certain. But one thing was undeniable. Somebody in Frankfort knew the truth. The case of Terry Sutter was no longer just about a boy's tragic death. It had become a story of a community's silence, a family's endless grief, and a grave desecrated so many times, it felt as though the killer was still out there, still watching. But if the town stayed silent, who were they protecting? And why would someone kill a 15-year-old boy in such a cruel, deliberate way? The search for answers would lead into the shadows, to secret investigations, hidden files, and even threats against those who dared to dig deeper. After the autopsy confirmed it was homicide, Frankfort police should have launched a full-scale investigation. But they didn't. No proper crime scene photos were taken. The beach was never secured. The kids who were with Terry that night? Questioned only lightly, then let go. It was as if the case was being treated not as a crime, but as a problem best forgotten. Years later, even retired officers admitted, "We dropped the ball." But in Frankfort, whispers told a darker story, that the investigation wasn't just lazy, it was suppressed. One of the most persistent theories was that Terry had gone to a beach party the night he died. Teenagers, alcohol, maybe even drugs. It wouldn't have taken much. A fight could have broken out. Maybe Terry saw something he wasn't supposed to. Maybe he mouthed off to the wrong person. A push became a beating. The beating turned into suffocation. And suddenly, a boy was dead. Panic set in. Nobody wanted to be blamed. So instead of calling for help, they left him there, face down in the sand. The open casket funeral, showing Terry's bruises, only added fuel to this theory. The entire town had seen the evidence with their own eyes. But if that theory was true, why didn't anyone come forward? Because in a small town, naming names doesn't just destroy one person. It destroys entire families. Some residents believed the killer wasn't a teenager at all. Frankfort, like many small towns, had its shadows. Adults with violent tempers, chronic drunks, men who lingered around kids when they shouldn't. And one name in particular was whispered, a man known for violence, a man people crossed the street to avoid. But here's the problem. Whispers never became statements. No one would testify. No one would go on record. And so, that theory, like so many others, died in silence. The most chilling theory was that someone in power, or connected to power, was involved. And that would explain everything. Why police treated it so lightly. Why crucial evidence disappeared. Why Terry's grave was desecrated, again and again, and nobody was ever caught. If this theory is true, then Terry's murder wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a crime, protected by silence. For Terry's mother and grandmother, every single day became a nightmare. They had no answers, they had no justice, and in the end, they didn't even have a gravestone to visit. Friends of the family would later recall how Terry's mother sometimes drove past the cemetery. She would slow the car and just stare, as if searching for a sign, a clue, a miracle that might finally bring her boy's story to light. But that miracle never came. What makes Terry's case so haunting isn't just the brutality of the murder, it's the way the town reacted. The silence, the rumors, the collective fear that if anyone spoke, the past would come roaring back to life. Even today, when Terry's name is mentioned, longtime residents look away. Some refuse to speak on camera, others quickly change the subject, as if the killer, or the killer's family, still walks among them. Was Terry the victim of a teenage fight gone too far? Was he silenced because he saw something he shouldn't? Or was his death protected by the very people who were supposed to bring him justice? The truth remains locked away, buried as deep as Terry's unmarked grave. But every unsolved murder has a way of resurfacing. And in Frankfort, some believe that day is still coming. For decades, Terry's murders sat in the dark corners of filing cabinets. No new leads, no suspects charged, no justice. But in the early 2000s, the Benzie County Sheriff's Department quietly admitted the truth. The case was still open. A few retired officers told outsiders, if someone came forward today, we'd still investigate. And yet, there were no press releases, no formal cold case unit, just silence. A silence that, in its own way, spoke louder than words. For years, local reporters tried to piece together the story. But every time they got close, doors slammed shut. Families refused interviews. Retired officers suddenly couldn't remember. Even Terry's closest friends stayed off camera. The case felt cursed. Then came the true crime era. Podcasts like Already Gone, and more recently Crime Junkie with Ashley Flowers, brought Terry's name back into the light. Ashley Flowers even went on record, calling Terry's murder one of Michigan's most haunting unsolved cases. She pleaded with listeners, if you know something, say something. And just like that, after decades of silence, Terry's story was no longer trapped in Frankfort. It was echoing across America. Social media gave Terry's case a second life. On TikTok, creators stitched videos of his story, asking, "Who killed Terry Sutter?" On Reddit, late-night threads spiraled with theories, some wild, some terrifyingly possible. On Facebook, cold case groups posted his photo again and again, pleading, "Does anyone remember this boy?" Hashtags like #JusticeForTerry and #UnsolvedMichigan began circulating, each one pulling Terry's story out of the shadows. And with every like, every comment, every repost, the silence of Frankfort cracked just a little bit more. Today, three major theories still dominate conversations. The party theory: Terry died at the hands of other teens, and fear silenced them. The local predator theory: an older, violent man killed him, and people were too afraid to accuse him. The cover-up theory: someone with power protected the killer, ensuring the case was buried forever. No theory has ever been proven, but all three remain chillingly possible. Perhaps the darkest part of Terry's story isn't the murder itself, but what came after. The repeated destruction of his gravestone, the erasure of his final resting place, and the chilling fact that today, if you walk into Frankfort Cemetery, you won't even find his name. It's as if someone wanted Terry to be forgotten. But here's the truth about forgotten names. Sometimes they echo louder than ever. What really happened to Terry Sutter on that September night in 1973? Who silenced a boy barely 16 years old? And why did an entire town choose silence over truth? 50 years have passed, but one question still lingers. Will justice ever come? For over 50 years, Terry's story has remained unsolved. But every small town carries its secrets. And secrets have a way of slipping out when you least expect them. Somewhere out there, someone still knows the truth. Maybe they've carried it for decades. Maybe it only escapes in whispers or in nightmares. But the truth never dies, and one day it will come to light. This was Mystery in the Dark. If you believe Terry Sutter deserves justice, don't just listen. Raise your voice. Share this story as far and wide as you can. so that a boy who was silenced 50 years ago may finally be heard. Maybe, just maybe, our voices together can bring Terry the justice he was denied. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. And tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Because every voice matters, and yours might be the one that makes the difference. Thanks for watching.